Hi there.
Hey. I guess I'll do the official welcome since I'm
Yeah.
running the show today. So, hi everybody. Welcome to Dev Empathy Book Club, where we inspire each other to become better developers and better people by building our empathy skills. Today, it's just two of us. So I'm Ariel, and Amy
Hey,
is
everyone.
joining me today, and we are going to be talking about The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman. So we've been reading this for about a month at this point, and hopefully that's given us a little bit of time to kind of think about things a little bit, mull over stuff in our heads, see how it does or doesn't apply to our lives. So, Amy, what have been your general reactions to the book, and is there anything that kind of stood out to you as how it's relevant in your life?
Yeah, so I have read this book as part of a book club, I think twice before. And it was both times it was through a company book club group. And so our team was kind of looking at it, looking for takeaways. And so it was really nice this time around to kind of just experience the book without any expectation that I would bring things that would be applicable, lessons to apply to our code base or our application directly. So I, having previously really disliked reading this book, I loved it. It was a ton of fun. And I really now love thinking about how a lot of the mechanical design that, would dominate people's work lives when they're working in obviously the example is the nuclear plant that he brings up first, but I think it's applicable to a lot of jobs that have a physical aspect. How a lot of the principles that we really want to bring to our jobs, those base principles are the same. So while I didn't necessarily get anything applicable out of like every paragraph I read, it was really lovely, journey into thinking about how we interact with the world.
Yeah, I'd second that. There's definitely pieces of it that are not so relevant, but when you look at things in the whole, grand scheme of things, suddenly, even if it's not even relevant to your career necessarily, but at least you're sort of like, okay, I'm not crazy. There are a lot of things in the world that are, I don't know if I would say broken or just, not designed in a way that optimizes for usability or discoverability. And it's sort of like the game is rigged for us to lose. I hate to say it. So being able to kind of have someone tell you like, yeah, no, it's okay. That is how it is. And, hopefully people are working on it. And you also have a part to play in it. Definitely is to some degree a source of comfort. The other part of it is that just like suddenly you start noticing, I mean, for me at least, is, suddenly you start noticing examples of poor design just like everywhere you go, everything that you do. And you just sort of start laughing about it. Like literally this morning, I have a 1-month-old baby. So I took her to a clinic it's for children who are under 5 years old. Just for some routine medical care. And basically, first of all, like I was given an address and I come to the address and it's not there, which was interesting. And finally I look around and try to figure out what's going on. And I see, oh, there's like a little path next to the building. So I kind of go there and like there's like a back entrance. So, okay, so it wasn't obvious from the outside, wasn't very discoverable, I would say. Mm-hmm. Because of the lack of signifiers, right? It was there, but there was nothing to indicate to me that this path was, gave me the affordance of getting to the clinic. Now I get there, and again, keep in mind, this is for kids who are under 5, right? Pretty much everyone who's showing up there is going to show up with a stroller. And I noticed that like the direct entrance to the building is with stairs, and then if you can have to like kind of go around and then come back, and you can come up a ramp. I thought to myself, well, pretty much everyone who goes into this building, is going to need the ramp. Like I could, maybe even in general, like, we should make ramps more accessible. But especially in a building where basically everyone who's coming in is going to need the ramp, you'd think like, let's maybe make the ramp not be the thing that, that's really hard to access. So I don't know if there's a specific design principle that I could point to, but it's just, one of these examples of like, the architect, as they're designing the building, maybe isn't thinking about, the way people are going to use it. And it's much harder to do that, to fix that on a building. Not impossible, but it's, it's certainly a little more difficult. It's definitely easier to fix on the kinds of products that we work on.
Yeah.
So yeah, just
I think that's fascinating that you talk about like the street you can't find. There's basically it's a sidewalk, but it's a road in my town that's called Russell Walk. And it literally is just a sidewalk going up, but there are houses where that is the only access. And so people get so confused trying to find this because there's no turnoff for cars, and you're still seeing like there's still that boulevard feeling of like there's line of trees separating you from your car from this walk up a hill. There's none of the standard indicators that this thing is anything other than a back alleyway. So it's really hilarious to see like people trying to host open houses up there. It's like, no one's gonna find that. But yeah, when I read the section on affordances, what actually got to me was when we got to talking about mappings, because I had a really hilarious experience with the first video game I tried to play seriously. Now, it had the affordance of being a video game. It was entertaining. It's called Slow by that game company. It's wonderful and is beautifully entertaining. But, and perhaps then I have the wrong word there, because for me it did not afford a beautiful experience, because its mapping was really weird. What the game is about, it's you are this creature, right, in this world, primordial world, and you go around and you eat larger microbial creatures, and you absorb them. Somehow you combine on the spot, create a new species, I don't know. But you are a creature in this kind of flat world. And so you have this controller, you're holding onto the controller like this, and you as this creature, you're directing it left and right. What becomes really difficult is that when the creature turns upside down, you need to change your mapping from, okay, I am this creature, to I'm controlling this creature on the screen. So when the creature turns upside down, to do a 360 rotation, you can't just go like this until it turns around fully. You have to do it like this to get the animal to turn this way. And then the second it turns upside down, then you have to be like, no, go this way. And it was this really hilarious struggle for me, because as a new video game player, I come in and I'm like, I want to identify with this creature, and I do it so well without any hesitation. I'm just like, my brain is in this creature. But I could also see, for someone who has been playing, Mario Brothers, Smash Brothers, I don't know, I hear these things, I'm terrible at them. It would totally make sense for them to, just try to be directing it. Kind of like I would point to the area that I want the animal to go to. And we just had such vastly different experiences in life. Me with no experience, and my imaginary other person who enjoys this game having a ton, that those experiences led to completely different mappings when we were presented with this game. And so I totally could not play it. It was hilarious.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, how video games are kind of one of those areas where there are not necessarily, like there are sort of conventions for mappings of controller, like how the buttons that you press, various controls to what happens on the screen, right, with your character. But it's not 100% agreed on across all games, and that can cause a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I think there's also something where you just build up experiences, and I have not done that. So like you have this world in which you maybe have like 3 or 4 mappings and you can pick and choose and combine them, you know, in the same way that I imagine you and I have a vast different set of experiences developing. But if you talk to me about, hey, an MVC framework, I'm going to have an immediate mapping in my head of like, gosh, I can imagine this, like we can have a good discussion.
Yeah, totally. It's funny, like as you're speaking about it, I'm thinking about like escape the room games and how it's, you know, it's sort of like the opposite there, right? Where the point is that there are not your natural mappings, and that's what makes it so confusing. And it's intentionally bad design because they're trying to trip you up, but it's good. It's like the idea is it should be just good enough design that if you struggle enough, you can figure it out. So it's kind of like balancing, you know, just how good the design should be. Which is kind of an intriguing way of going about things.
Thinking about it, you have kind of experiencing the privilege where you're not today like to and say like 3 minutes.
Sorry, this is weird. I don't know if the oh no, now I see you again. Okay, I couldn't see you for a while. I'm not really sure why. And I don't hear you either. I assume you hear me?
I hear you, yes.
Yes. Okay. So maybe just try refreshing, because I don't know what happens if I refresh. I never tried this. Like it might kill the whole broadcast. Sorry, 2 hours about the small delay. Oh, okay, I hear sound again. This is good. No, never mind. All right, I'm going to try refreshing, and if it doesn't work, if the broadcast dies, then I'll just start another one and post the link in the chat. Hello. Hello. All right, well, this is going to get very lonely very quickly. Amy, are you there? I lost Amy, although I see her in the Hangout now. All right. All right, well, in the meantime, I guess I don't want to bore everybody, so I will go on and chat about something that that I found interesting, and hopefully Amy will eventually reappear. So there's this quote that I saw along the way in the book, which really kind of appealed to me. That it sort of reminded me of a lot of sketch comedy, not sketch comedy, stand-up comedy routines. And you know, it's funny because it's the kind of thing that like people talk about as though like it's just going to be kind of this way forever. And you know, in reality, it's the kind of thing that, you know, if we thought about it more and if we were able to apply design principles, we'd actually be able to change it. So the author was just, this is on page 152. The author was describing various ways of going about designing shower controls. And this is something that if you've ever, you know, traveled to, you know, to hotels, different places, you know, you went to be a guest at someone's house, You know, it was, it's probably something that's driven you a little bit crazy. You know, you come to the shower and it's just like this totally unfamiliar contraption. Like, you know, there's, you know, maybe there's one handle, maybe there's two, maybe there's three. You know, you don't know if it goes up or down, you know, right or left. So some people decided, well, you know, the human body is designed as a mirror image. So why don't we have the controls rather than all being kind of a standard, like, you know, unscrewing motion to turn it higher and then screwing motion, you know, the clockwise to turn off the water. Instead, let's have it be parallel. So one way is to turn on the water, the other way is to turn off. I'm not even sure if it's on off or on off. So here's how the author describes it. As you try to control the water temperature, soap running down over your eyes, groping to change the water control with one hand, soap or shampoo clutched in the other, you are guaranteed to get it wrong. If the water is too hot, if the water is too cold, sorry, the groping hand is just as likely to make the water colder as to make it scalding hot. Whoever invented that mirror image nonsense should be forced to take a shower. So essentially, you know, the point is that if you ever actually tried using this in the shower, you'd realize at some point, like, this doesn't really work. If I can't see, I kind of assume that things work a certain way, and you know, again, screwing, unscrewing, that sort of thing. And, you know, suddenly things don't work the way that you expected. So, you know, or like, you know, based on the handle that you happen to hit, you know, when you don't have the mirror image symmetry available, it just doesn't work for you. You know, while I could see other opinions here, I think the general point pretty clearly holds, which is you can't figure out whether a design is good or not in the abstract. A design is not inherently good or bad. It's only good or bad in the context of the people who are going to be using it. And to me, this really reminded me of user testing, basically. So, you know, I'm sure that many of you have had this experience. I remember that on my first professional software development team, so I was pretty far removed. You know, I was kind of more junior and just kind of like taking orders from product people and UX people, whatever, and converting that into code and shipping it, and great. And I didn't really have a sense of what product people did. And so one day we had like a hangout where we used the website user testing, which if you're not familiar with it, it lets you basically, it's kind of like crowdsourcing user tests. So you give them like a set of instructions. They have like 10 minutes to complete the instructions. You give them a task to accomplish. You tell them as little as possible, and you see how they, crawl around, figure out how to use your product. So, so just watching people use it who are not familiar with the system already is a really different experience than just trying to imagine it in your own head. And there's various levels of it, right? There's as you're doing development, maybe you would test with a mock-up, maybe you would test with who knows what else. Before you actually have a developed product. Once you have developed product, before you actually launch into production, maybe you have a round of user testing to validate your ideas. Once you get past that, you actually launch it. There might be some A/B testing before you fully go live with it. And even when you fully go live, but to continue to track, is this something that people get confused by, or is it something that is people really understand, right? When for our actual users, not just the users that we imagine in our heads. So it looks like Amy's back. Welcome back.
I am. Yeah, we have a house undergoing construction next door, and we think they just knocked the lines a little bit. But fun times. So sorry to drop off like that. Where did you end up?
So I just mentioned the point of that we can design, really, really nicely for abstract users, but until we have people actually using our product who don't already know how it works, because if you come and you already have a mental model, it's not that hard to use any product pretty much. The real challenge is if you come in and you have no idea how the product works or even how it's supposed to work, right? At least for something like like a door or or a teapot or something, I don't know, like that's kind of stuff that he talks about in the book. Usually it's stuff that you know how it's supposed to work. You just, you don't necessarily know how to get from from point A to point B in terms of, I have this idea that I want to get a certain task accomplished. I know how this is supposed to accomplish a task for me. I just don't know exactly how to work with the item that's in front of me. In the case of a web app, let's say, or a native app, or and anything that is more complex, you don't always even know what you want to accomplish. So taking someone who doesn't really have all that knowledge, walking in and getting them in an intuitive way to the point of them actually accomplishing the thing that they need to accomplish, is pretty rough to do in the abstract, right? We've seen in the book a lot of examples of even not in the abstract, again, in the abstract on very simple devices. It's not enough. You really need to see how people use it. All the more so for the kind of products that we create, which are highly complex, and in which the goals aren't always inherently clear.
Yeah, I think my favorite story for how much the way you have written something can kind of compound in a team into this like alternate worldview that seems crazy to anyone who would actually end up using your product is one of the original keyboards and how it interacted with a typing program. So like the very, very early Word. I can't remember what like the MS-DOS version of this would be, right? But so there was no backspace button on keyboards because instead what there was a key that said like reverse. And so to do a backspace, you would do the reverse button, which might actually have been called back, and then you would type a space. And then you could continue typing a space to go back. You were essentially reversing the direction of what you were typing. So you could, if you wanted to, like type or hit the reverse button and then type a space and then type, exclamation point I capital H, and what you would end up with is hi, exclamation point space. And a user, when they first interacted with this, was like, this is crazy. I just want a backspace button. Just let me have one button that like just clears everything out, and then I'll start over typing forwards. And the initial developers of this system were like, no, that's illogical. The logical thing is to have this back button or this reverse button and allow people to type backwards, which to us sounds crazy because I can't spell words backwards to save my life. And then you're also thinking about like what you're replacing over. So you're not just reversing the word, you're having to like understand what you're writing over. And it's just too much for our brains to handle. We just want to like nuke the entire misspelling and then work from there. But they were so defensive of it, and it was just such a thing that was ingrained in how they thought of their product as being useful.
That's so interesting. I'm curious. How long ago are we talking?
Oh, like super. Like this is like Bell Labs days, right? Okay. Where like you're first being introduced to the mouse kind of operating systems.
Yeah, my mom was actually at Bell Labs probably around that time. So fun fact. I think she was there before the mouse.
Yeah.
She wrote a print server before those were standard. So I'm curious actually if like, what was the thing that drove them there? Was that a matter of kind of conforming to some pre-existing standard? Like, was that to do with like the fact that with typewriter you can't really like undo, you have to like write over it with, I guess,
yeah. I mean, it might be, but you think with a mechanical typewriter, you would just push it back, you white it out, you push it all the way back, and you write forward. And this is a story I heard many years ago, so I don't remember the details. But yeah, it is fascinating to see how some of these cultures about like the right way to do something, when there is no objectively right way, there's only something that is understandable to humans. And as the author notes, like a lot of that is cultural, but it's not just cultural for, you know, you're Japanese or you're American. It is also the cultures that we create around ourselves, within our teams, within our companies, within, you know, our groups of people that we associate with. And so, yeah, I mean, I think about that when I hear things like, you know, well, we have to do something this way in code because it's, you know, clearly the best way for people to understand what they're seeing. And it's not always true.
Well, that leads to the text editor wars and the, you know, all the various wars, right? Pretty much.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And it's funny because, you know, if you actually look across the divide, I mean, the actual people on different sides of the divide in programming communities aren't always all that different. It's really just a matter of, you know, where ideas happen to start and take hold. And what's funny is you fast forward 5 years, sometimes, you know, one community will kind of completely abandon its stance on something. Like, you know, I look at the PHP community now, and, you know, if you look at them, you know, 5-10 years ago, like, who heard of writing tests? And today, it's, you know, I wouldn't say it's as common as in, let's say, like the Ruby or the JavaScript community, but it's getting there. And it's really fascinating to watch, you know, how much, you know, this sort of like assumption that, you know, that often, you know, you have on the more like, you know, the hipster languages or whatever you want to call them, you know, those communities, you know, to some degree look down on other communities as well. You know, you have bad practices or whatever, and in reality, it's just like there's a convention that needs a little bit of time to be broken, and that's okay. It does take a little bit of time. I mean, you know, Java is you know, moving also in a very different direction. It's, you know, it's pretty, to me, it's quite interesting. And, you know, and at the same time, you also have, I mean, you know, you don't even have to necessarily go to Japan to find other cultures, right? Even within, you know, even within the same country, the same community, you often have a number of different cultures. And, you know, I actually thought it was really interesting. One thing that the author pointed out, that it's really easy to come off as incredibly rude in one community, not based on any right or wrong, just based on you don't know the convention. You know, and I'm thinking about, like, you know, imagine if I was at a fancy dinner party and I have, like, you know, 15 knives and 14 forks, and then I have like 8 spoons arranged in different places, and like I would have no idea what to do with anything. And, you know, you laugh at it, but there are people who'd be like, oh, that's incredibly, you know, uncivilized. How could you, you know, how could you not know what you're doing in that situation? Like, that's awful. And there isn't actually a right and wrong about that. It's just, but it's important to be aware of as someone who might come, you know, because we all really are in that position of, we might end up judging someone about something that's purely a cultural norm, you know, not even noticing that we're doing it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think about some of these cultural choices as trade-offs. It's not just that, like, hey, like, different people have different cultures. They're choices about how we balance things. I think one of the most interesting things that I've seen on my current team is that we're making increasing moves to stability within our application that are sometimes, you know, there are so many safeguards that it can seem a little bit ridiculous. But that's only because where we were was a place of trying to ship a lot of new features and a little bit more acceptance of a little bit of downtime here and there. And making that move to value uptime purely at the cost of a slower pace of development, to start valuing code practices that are, you know, uglier, but are in theory safer. Of course, then you get into the debates about what does safe code look like. But adding things like, you know, explicit returns to Ruby. that does not seem like idiomatic Ruby to a lot of people. It seems wrong. But does it provide an extra level of safety against certain bugs? Absolutely. Is that the right choice? Maybe, maybe not. It really depends on what you value, which implies what your culture is, and what choices you're going to make to continue those values and to change them. But it is very much something that makes people uncomfortable within their own code base.
Yeah, it's true. We do kind of tend to the perception that there's one right way to do things, and there really isn't a right. I mean, there is such a thing as right and wrong. You know, at least I believe there's a thing that's right and wrong, but it doesn't mean that there's always a right and a wrong way to do everything. And one way I've seen of explaining it that I really liked was Kent Beck has what he calls the 3X framework, where he describes how projects run through 3 phases, which he calls explore, expand, and extract. Basically, explore is you're just trying a bunch of different experiments, trying to, you know, look for something that, you know, that would be worth pursuing. Expand is where you're growing that from kind of a minimum viable product to a fully developed, full-blown product. And then extract is where you really start to extract the maximum profits out of what you've already built up. And so you're making very, very small changes. You want everything to be very, very safe. There's already a lot that's been invested. The risk kind of goes much, much higher as you move through the process. And so the practices that you want to follow right at the beginning, where, you know, you're trying something new every 2 weeks and you might throw it all away, are very different than what you're practicing at the end, where everything is designed to survive the next 10 years plus.
Yeah.
And it's completely situational. It's completely based on just the needs of the current state that you're in, the amount of risk that you're trying to avoid, the amount of risk that you're comfortable taking on. Yeah. Because there's some amount that you've already built up and you don't want to lose it. How much have you already invested in this, right? If it's 2 weeks versus if it's 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and something that I have continually kind of felt like this book misses, because this author is really grounded in the physical aspects, and his interactions with technology are more as a user. I think as people who work on applications that change a lot over time, that there is no perfect design. There is no way to talk about your current design as expressing one kind of thing. It's always a little bit of past, a little bit of future. It's always in transition. And to talk about it in the same way that one would talk about watch design, where once that thing comes off of the production line, it goes out to a customer and you're never going to see it again, unless obviously there's a recall and, you know, you have an exploding battery, and that's absolutely terrible. But you're not going to, let's say, you know, send a field agent in and say, well, we really wanted to add this third button. You know, someone's eating their breakfast while, you know, you have an engineer tinkering. Oh, we're just going to add on another button. Yeah, maybe like add like 3 more while we're at it. And the emphasis on the fact that one can focus on a particular design as an expression of a particular goal, a particular way of thinking that a company had about a product, isn't necessarily as applicable in an environment where you're trying to balance what the company was, what it thinks it is now, and where it thinks it's going. And your code base is like it's an expression of like all of these things all at the same time. And that the product that a user sees, especially given that I work primarily on backend, so, you know, you can talk about UI as something that a user interacts with, but like they're not going to really interact with the API in the same way that I think our author really thinks about users interacting with a technical product. And it feels very, very strange to think about a single design that you sit down and you think about and you can analyze, because it's not going to change underneath you.
Yeah, it's definitely true. I mean, it depends on the kind of software you're writing. I mean, you know, if you're writing native stuff or you're writing for some some company that has, for whatever reason, very, very infrequent releases. So you're a little bit more into that territory. But, on the whole, that's a really good point, that we do have a lot more flexibility to iterate and to change.
Yeah, I think it means it's harder to analyze any one thing for intent. You can analyze it absolutely for how well it's serving users, and most of the time, obviously, it has a lot to improve. But it's harder I found it's harder to apply a lot of these principles because they assume that someone like actually sat down and thought about or chose not to, right? Totally ignored something. But they assume that like there was a design process as opposed to about 50 design processes that are all built on top of each other.
Right. When you say 50 design processes, you're referring to like the iterative approach?
Yeah. So like, you get comps one day for something, and then you get another set of comps that are, for a different portion, but also include this other thing that was redesigned last May. And they're going to pull some aspects of that. And then there's a total redesign of all CSS assets coming in 3 months. And so you're going to partially pull some of that for one section. And so obviously that can result in a really frenetic user experience, but a lot of companies do it pretty well, right? Like everything, you slowly have changes, but you're introducing people to them slowly. But there was never any particular intent, any single intent for the entire product as a whole. It's constantly built up through smaller sprints, smaller iterations, or even, large, even if you have quarterly releases, you're not gonna, if you have a large enough product, you're not gonna totally redesign your entire product in a quarter.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of at the very end. So we read for this discussion up through the end of chapter 4, and the very, very end of chapter 4 talks about skeuomorphic design, which is basically that you create a product that has all the functionality of a prior product, but there's no real reason for it to look like the old product, right? So for example, let's say you're creating a sound design system that's completely digital. There's no reason why it has to look like an analog system, but very often it will anyway, because that's what people are familiar with. So the example that was given in the book was for electric cars that are really, really quiet. They need to make sound so that blind people or people who are looking the other way can hear the car as it's coming and don't get hit by it. They can plan they're walking around, there's a car coming. And kind of the general assumption is it should sound something like how what's the name of whatever, regular cars, gasoline powered cars, combustion engines. That's what I'm looking for. So they should sound something like combustion engines. Even though there's no real reason for it to specifically sound like combustion engines, just because that's what people already have in their heads as this is what a car sounds like. It'll be much easier to make the transition.
Yeah.
And then I think about Twitter, for example, made like the big redesign lately, and it didn't even look that different, but like people were freaking out because like it's different than the old Twitter, whereas if they had to kind of move a little bit more slowly, people like slow change. People don't like very, very quick change.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, especially as it applies to our digital interfaces, where it can really belie how old you are by asking people to explain the iconography. So for instance, if you ask a 5-year-old why the phone button on your phone looks like what it does, they'll be like, well, it's a phone button. That's how I make my call. But if you explain like, no, that like actually used to be the thing that you like hold up to your face, and like that's why it looks kind of like this. No, this is what a phone looks like. It's a rectangle. What are you trying to tell me? And so yeah, there's some really funny and cute examples of designers interacting with their children when it comes to digital interfaces, and while they can pick up the intent of something, they have no understanding about why. And so it's actually not that intuitive. They just have to learn what, you know, this random photo actually means.
And it's the same thing with iconography on computers, which is one of the book's examples, right? Is, you know, why are they called folders and files, and why do they have those icons? Like, you know, they're direct. Well, files, I guess, have always been there, but you know, like directories versus folders. You know, when someone says one word or the other, you're like, oh, you said, you know, folder. You're probably from a less technical background because you're thinking of an actual folder because that's what the icon looks like, right? And you know. And like, when was the last time you used an actual folder if you don't work in a legal or medical office?
Yeah.
But
well,
it's a useful way of thinking about things. So it continues to be how people conceptualize it.
Yep. Yeah, the fact that the word icon was blue and blue lined. First of all, the blue line is not it's more cultural than that. And the fact that the text is horizontal as opposed to vertical is also very cultural.
That's true. That is very true. I wouldn't even like thought of that because, you know, I can like read and write a couple different languages, but they're all horizontal.
Yeah.
I wonder if they have a different icon for vertical writing countries.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting point. I think the other thing is that no, maybe I'm misremembering that red ink is used for guides more than blue ink elsewhere, but I think that's not true.
I think all the Microsoft products kind of like grab their own color, like Word is blue and PowerPoint is red, so that's just the color.
Oh yeah, but there's a reason for all of those, or many of those colors, right? They're meant to have certain emotional ties.
Right. Excel is probably money. That's why it's green. So in this whole realm of you know, just kind of skeuomorphism and designing things that are familiar, that are comfortable. So I actually had an experience recently that was interesting. I needed to write a Ruby client for a JSON API compliant API. I hate that JSON API is not Googleable, by the way. That was a very good example of bad design. But so I found a couple that were out there, and it was really interesting that they all seemed to mirror the syntax of Active Record. And it was interesting because, you know, if you were trying to design it around let's maximize the capabilities of JSON API, you'd probably have it be a little bit more different. But because it's in Ruby, and you know, to use Ruby is basically to use Rails, not 100%, but certainly I've heard in Europe it's actually quite different. But in the US, basically to use Ruby is to use Rails. And so everyone who uses Ruby knows Active Record, and so that's like the syntax that everybody knows. So why create a whole new syntax when you already have a syntax that everybody knows? And it's, you know, it's much easier for people to discover all the capabilities of the tool. And there's actually a lot of logic to that, you know, from a design perspective. Again, this idea of skeuomorphism.
Yeah, I think so. One, I might take a little bit of issue with in the US, Ruby and means Rails, because that has not been my experience. But I'm sure I am. Well, obviously, as one person, I can't speak to any broader statistic. But I think another interesting example there is Diesel, which is the kind of Active Record. It's the ORM for Rust that's gaining a lot of popularity, and it's written by or maintained by the maintainer of Active Record. And so there are a lot of similarities in the syntax of, well, okay, so syntax would imply probably both the actual syntax of the code, but what I meant to imply was that the functions are named similarly. Obviously, it takes a very different look. I mean, it's in Rust. It doesn't look like it has Ruby syntax, but the choice of interfaces, which methods or which functions are available is based off of the methods that are available in Ruby, and you would be able to infer a lot. Obviously, there are so many edge cases to Active Record, many of which I hope were not in fact ported over to Diesel. But I think that's another case where the interface is being explicitly designed to bring over Rubyists, as well as, there's a lot of knowledge built up by the Active Record team as to what does provide a meaningful and closer to intuitive interface. And I'm sure they're reapplying those lessons there.
Cool. Interesting insight. I'm going to shift gears at this point to a little bit of a different topic, but one that I've really thought about a lot, not just reading this book, but in the past, and it kind of helped things become a little bit clearer to me. So I think it's really summed up very nicely in this one line from the book, which is the most effective way of helping people remember is to make it unnecessary. So as programmers, we have this like massive cognitive overload all the time of like all the things we have to remember. You have to remember how your language works and how your framework works. And, if you're on the back end, you have to remember also like whatever JavaScript things are happening. You might be full stack in some capacity, in which case like you really have way too much to remember. And maybe you work in, in Ember on some things and, React on others, or, maybe you're dabbling in Vue.js and like you have to remember all the D3 syntax for, some of those, fancy chart stuff. There's like way too much to remember, and that's just at the level of like being able to write the code. Then there's all the domain knowledge, all the knowledge about all the little tidbits about your system, the things that you have to remember. This is very performant, but this is really, really bad. So don't go this route for something. There's always a whole bunch of things on our heads to remember. And the book spoke a lot about the idea of knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world. And how very often when there are just too many things for us to remember, one of the best strategies we can use is to just remove the need to remember things. So that could be either by just making something automatic, that it'll just happen if, and you don't have to remember to do it. The other way is to embed the knowledge in the world in some way so that you don't necessarily have to you don't have to actively, keep it in your head. You just are able to consult it in some way when you need that knowledge. It's in some very easily accessible place, ideally somewhere that it'll pop up, right when you need it, depending on the situation. And we do a lot of this, I think, in programming, but it's worth thinking about, just kind of being cognizant of it, but B, where we can maybe do it a little bit more. The things that pop into my head are like bash shortcuts. I definitely have a lot of those for the things that I do most frequently, where I don't want to either I don't want to type it out, or I want to just make sure that I don't forget all the crazy amount of syntax that I have to remember. Stuff that you set up in your text editor, various scripts, searchable documentation of various sorts. Thankfully everything is online. Once upon a time. And this is stuff I've heard from prior generations. You'd have to walk down the hall to that person who had the manual that you need, and then find the right page, and then you could write the next word in your editor. Now it's a little bit easier. You also don't have punch cards, so there's been a lot of changes. But and of course then aside from all that, we have Stack Overflow to kind of catalog for us. Stack Overflow blog posts, all kinds of online resources. Some of them we might end up bookmarking, right? But basically just kind of taking all this knowledge that that's there, that knowledge is what makes us powerful, that makes us able to accomplish a tremendous amount without reinventing the wheel. But at the same time, it's a lot to remember. And so how do we embed that in the tools that we use and in the environment where we work?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. I think it's also something that brings to mind the need to balance some of these efforts to bring better design with the fact that, ultimately it takes a lot of time and money to do those. And so a lot of the time I see us applying those lessons more to operational stuff where we do expect someone to be having to do it at 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. but after being up for a while. And so there it is totally worth it to invest tons of time in making something intuitive and aware of all the mistakes that you could make because you're human, and double checking to the degree it can, making sure that you're never having to copy and paste something because you might miss the last character, that sort of thing. But then I think it's interesting to think about what would it mean for like an entire code base to have better design for its engineers. And I don't know what that looks like. And I think this book has been really, reading this book has really it's been interesting to think about how little I know exactly about that. I have a lot of guesses, I have a lot of opinions, but I don't necessarily know exactly what that looks like, because one, what we do is complex. Two, you're trying to negotiate human understanding with computer understanding, and you're trying to change everything in mid-flight because there are new business rules that you need to implement. But I do think it's an interesting thing to think about, because I came pretty quickly to the conclusion of like, yeah, it's kind of my job to like deal with all of this like ridiculousness. And that, ultimately, like, because we don't know how to make this easier, we're in a situation where we just kind of continue to skate by and assume that, we're gonna pay you enough to stick around so that you are willing to cram all these things into your head, and to not make it worse and to try to make it better. But ultimately, like, every improvement is going to be met with a new feature request. So it's been interesting to think about, like, am I just here? Is like 50% of my like success just memorizing all the quirks and the bad design that we have to deal with, and how it might interact with the other bad designs that we have?
Yeah, and the other part of it is you just don't know at the time what's going to be bad design.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard to, like, go back and say, well, let's re-architect this when we have so many other things that we need to do.
Yeah. Well, and it's also,
it can be worth it. It can also not be worth it. It really depends.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, Codebase I work on, like, when it was initially designed in like 2012, 2013, the initial architects like went out speaking about it. They wrote blog posts, like those are still referenced. And those concepts that they used to build this application, I have to wonder what it would be like for me to walk up to them and be like, so do you still think this is a good idea? Really? But the thing is, when I check out the code base to the like initial commit, or 3 months in, they make so much more sense. They are these things of beauty for a code base that is a quarter the size. And so it's really interesting to look at that and to think, like, gosh, we kind of are less willing to say that, oh, this pattern is just terrible. It's the wrong one. Because it was just so perfect, 5 years ago. And these people that we really admire for, founding and creating this code base that is still, like, for what it has to do, is pretty darn good. Like, we think about these concepts as kind of, the values of the code base, when really at this point they're like in tatters and totally unworkable in many cases. It's interesting to think about just how much is hard to get away from those ideas.
Yeah, would you describe that as? I know you mentioned that you really like the idea of accidental affordances becoming strong signifiers. Is that kind of what you're getting at here?
No. So I think what the author talks about when he's thinking about accidental affordances are things that were like not intentionally created. So like what I'm talking about is probably like broader things, like clearly defined, like, you know, if MVC was just something that like someone just wrote some code and all of a sudden it became MVC. That's kind of what accidental affordances might be. So I think like they're both things that can kind of mess you up in a code base, right? There's the fact that like sometimes your architecture and design that you think so hard about and is so perfect for 5 years ago is no longer correct, and it's really hard to walk away from those ideas. And then, yeah, there are accidental affordances where like you let something small kind of creep into the code base. You know, it's like, you know, the first person to kind of put something in the trash when it's a public trash bin in a park and you know it's full. And so you want to go find, but someone else has put, you know, they put a pizza box on top of it. So clearly now, like, it's totally acceptable to just like throw all your trash on top of it. I think that's more like, that's more the like the accidental affordances. I see it, it's all the time. Like even code that you think might be temporary, or you know is temporary, and you're 100% confident that you are going to pull that out like in a week after you've run the script. Well, what happens if during the week in which you're running this script, someone else needs to write a new script and they're like, oh, I'll just copy this. And they're like, oh man, Amy wrote some great code here. I'm just gonna copy this because, you know, it's been a while since they wrote a script. Maybe it's their first time, they're from another team. They don't know what a good script looks like. So like, yeah, that one, that looks great. And so you end up in a situation where like, you know, your shortcut maybe wasn't that bad. And then the next shortcut, it's not terrible. But then you have like this code base littered with trash and it's out of control because people can't hold opinions about every single thing in your code base about what is the right pattern for every single line of code. So people are, well, I mean, if you have a smaller code base, sure. I guess I should say I'm talking more about the larger unwieldy size. But you know, there's always going to be some pattern matching. You're always going to look for, you know, the previous code to help you kind of understand the lay of the land, create that initial mapping of like, all right, here, you know, if I press this button, if I write this line of code, it's probably going to go off and do this one thing in the database. And if you don't maintain a lot of vigilance for those things, you can end up with a lot of, you know, poor code that basically signals that you don't necessarily care about a particular issue.
I think that was a really nice statement of the E principle. Sandy Metz has these 4 principles which form the acronym of TRUE, and the 4th one is E for exemplary. And the idea of the principle is basically this, right? That whatever code you write is going to become kind of a template for future code. And whatever code you write now, everyone else is going to assume like, oh, that's just the way that you're supposed to write code in this project, and they're just going to copy it. And the danger of writing, you know, poor code isn't just the code that you're writing and the thing that's going to affect here. It's that it tends to multiply across your entire project because people see it and just start copying. Whether literal copy paste or just copying the style.
Yeah.
Or like you said, assuming that like some issue that this code kind of brushes aside, okay, apparently that issue doesn't matter, so we're also going to brush it aside.
Yeah, I think it's definitely related to something the author gets into in the book, where if it's like, if I don't have to know something, if I can outsource my knowledge, I'm going to do that. And so a lot of us, like, I know where to look if I need to do a thing, and I'll refresh my memory by looking at other code examples, or I'll know what word to search for in the code base in order to find this one thing that logs in this particular way to Librato or Splunk, right? Like I know how to retrieve the information from the current code base, but I don't have the time to memorize or to even think deeply about every single thing in the code base. And so you end up in this situation where exactly that, like your mistakes, your lack of care at one moment is just going to compound throughout the lifetime of this code base.
Yeah, I think if I could kind of sum up what you're saying, and I really do like this point. The author talks about, as I mentioned before, knowledge in the head and knowledge in the world, and knowledge in the world can also be false knowledge, right? It can be things that we plant unintentionally, hopefully not intentionally, but even if we're doing it by accident, um, knowledge of, oh, this is how we write code here, or anything else, that someone would then come and assume that this is actually how it's supposed to be, and move from there.
Yeah.
Which is also how you have practices that, like even outside of the realm of programming, right? Any kind of, let's say immoral or terrible practice that exists in the world, where people say, oh, it exists, therefore it should exist, right? That's that same thinking at work, because we can't think about every last thing that goes on. And so in order to minimize the amount of knowledge we have to maintain in our heads, and the amount of understanding we have to develop, because there is a lot to develop, we basically just assume, oh, if it is this way, there's probably a reason. And doesn't mean that we shouldn't do that. It just means that anytime we establish a practice, whether in the code base or at work, or whether it's anywhere in our lives, we are potentially establishing knowledge in the world, which could impact a lot more than the thing that we think we're impacting. So I see we're hitting up against our hour, or we're just past the end of our hour. There is one issue that I really didn't want to leave out. I slated it first, but then we had some technical difficulties, so we're just going to loop back to it now. We'll count this as kind of the 5 minutes that we missed. But this is something that Amy, that you mentioned, that that you care about a lot. I do as well. Basically, the idea of human error, and how it's not human error, right? It's or rather, it's just because a human doesn't do the thing that we would want them to do or expect them to do, doesn't mean that it's because they did anything wrong. It's often the system is designed for them to fail. So I'm guessing that you had some thoughts you wanted to share about that, and then I'll throw in whatever I have as well.
Yeah. So I think we're going to get into some of this more in detail in the next chapter.
I think that's chapter 5. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was a really great quote that just really resonated with me. And it was on page 39. They said, "Many people do experience difficulties, but explain them away by blaming themselves. They simply think, I'm being stupid." And that is a phrase I pretty much use on the daily when interacting with my code base. I tack on to pretty much any request for help. Or maybe I'm being stupid, or I'm probably being stupid. I must be being stupid, but I could use some help. And I think it's something where we struggle to actually dig deeper. And it's a way of saying, this is more than my brain can process right now. But we don't actually engage in the underlying issues, because I think, as we've been talking about, it's just, code bases can grow to the point where it's just too complex. And, you can solve that by breaking something apart and doing microservices, but then the organization becomes a little too complex to talk about. So I think it's really kind of an admission that the job is essentially undoable to a standard of perfection that we have in our head, and we just use "I'm being stupid" as a shorthand. But I feel like there must be a better way to express this that is not derogatory to ourselves, but is also not a complete lamentation about the state of software. Because the flip side of "I must be being stupid" is this refrain of "Oh, but software is terrible. Everything is terrible." And I don't think that's good either, right? I think we need to find a way of saying yeah, some of the software that we work with, it's this amalgamation of a ton of different libraries, none of which is perfectly designed, and together they create a real mess. And on top of that, we've built all of our business logic. And so what you're left with is something that doesn't have intentional design, and is difficult to work with. It's challenging. It does something incredibly important, but it's just not fixable to have it get to the point where you can do your job perfectly as a human being. And I wish there was a better way to express that without being kind of down on yourself or down on the code base, because it's the situation we're in often. And we shouldn't like feel a need to like be, I don't know, derogatory towards things that just kind of are.
Yeah, I think nonviolent communication might have a few tips in that regard. Meaning, don't speak about how how you're stupid. Don't speak about how the software is is bad or the tool you're using is bad. You can just say, I really I'm feeling really frustrated because I'd like to accomplish a certain task and I can't figure out how to do it given the constraints that are in front of me. I can't find the magical incantation that I need in order to make this work. And I don't think that's that's negative on yourself, right? It's understood. What we do for a living is basically be confused most of the time. So,
Yeah.
So I think people would be pretty understanding of that. And we all know that the tools that we work with are not always as intuitive as they could be. So, it's not a statement of, well, I can't figure out and therefore now I hate Angular. It's just saying, I can't figure this out right now and I need help. And of course it's important on the other end of things to say, yeah, that's reasonable. That's okay that you're, I mean, if, it's sort of like the wizard ninja rock star problem, right? That, if you're expected to know how to do everything right off the bat, then, A, your employer is going to be very disappointed. But B, what a terrible thing to do to a person to expect them to know the unknowable.
Yeah.
It's impossible to always know how to do everything, and part of the job is to learn. And that's okay. Now, from the perspective of someone building a software solution, building a library, building a language or a framework, your job is to help people not ever feel this. So that's a whole different discussion, and maybe we'll talk about it more in the next round. But I do think that is just some good food for thought of how do you design tools that guide people towards the right things. I think it was Rust that I saw has done a really good job of creating error messages that are extremely descriptive, that are always trying to guide you towards, here's the problem that you're running into, here is how you solve it. And there are languages and there are tools that do that. Obviously highly recommended by the author of this book, who spoke about, I think he called them design and guidance messages, which, it's a little bit extreme in a way, but I think it's a really good attitude to take as someone who's creating a tool, to think about, okay, in the real world, errors happen. How do I help the people who are using my tool to move past there? In the ideal situation, right, you don't even necessarily just like look at just look at the manual. You start out by just like saying, okay, I think this should work, and then you hit an error, and the error will kind of guide you to getting the next step. I mean, I certainly would love to work in an environment that worked like that, where the errors are really helpful in guiding you towards doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard thing to do with our.
It is very difficult. I'm not saying that it's super easy.
Well, what I was going to say, yeah, no, I think there are languages that do a far better job of that too. It's just they're not the ones that a lot of programmers work in, and they're a little more experimental. So it is kind of interesting to see like kind of what is a language optimizing for. And a lot of the ones that optimize for comprehension, readability, Ruby and Python are decent. But yeah, like understanding error messages is not like the primary selling point of any major language, I don't think.
I'm curious I'm sure it varies from implementation to implementation, but Smalltalk has probably the best integrated development environment. and I specifically don't say IDE because IDE has come to mean fancy text editor, and Smalltalk gives you so much more than that in just a little bit that I've seen. It's like kind of incredible, and I would love to work in a language that gave me what Smalltalk gives you. You know, like I think AvdiGrid made like a 7-minute video where he just like basically says, here's why you should feel depressed that that you work in Ruby, because here's what Smalltalk does for you, and he shows how you're like, okay, so here's my input, here's my output. You know, like I have a string that looks like this, I want a string that looks like that. Now tell me what I should write in my code to make it do that, and they'll be like, oh, this is the something method that on a string that converts it from this format to that format. And it's just able to figure out what you want to do, which is crazy. So I have no idea how you build a tool that does that, but kudos to the people who did.
Yeah.
Like amazing design in action. So are there any closing thoughts? Or we'll just wait for next time.
Yeah, I think for me, like the next chapters where we talk about things that get closer to blamelessness in design and when there are errors, both on the user side, don't blame your users, but also then thinking about, well, the developers were also users of tools. I think that'll be really engaging. But for now, I'm just excited to get into those chapters, or that chapter.
Yeah, same. I have thought a lot about how design principles might apply not just to products or whether physical or digital, but also to human processes. I have a friend who I have no idea where he got the line from, but he once said, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the outcomes that it achieves. And so if you want to understand why a system leads to some negative effect, again, very often a political system or or some kind of process. In this case, I'm thinking about Agile and all of its various related process systems, Scrum, Kanban, XP, whatever. What results they tend to lead to, not just when it's done right, but also when it's done wrong, because the people who are who do it quote unquote wrong are also users of the system whose experiences deserve just as much attention as the ones who do it right. I didn't want to speak about it this time because I didn't want to do it till after we go through chapter 5. But one thing I'd really like to talk about next time around is how we might apply the principles of design to things like how we actually structure our teams, our workflows, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's going to be a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, definitely.
And look forward to having it next time. Hopefully with 3 of us, maybe even more. Who knows?
Yeah.
So the last thing that I'll say before we close up the Hangout, we have made the decision. Originally, we were on Goodreads. Now we are switching to Slack. It might even close down the Goodreads club. Gotta still decide that. But we have a public Slack channel that'll be on our site within the next couple of days. And just y'all can come in, chat with us, chat with each other, and think about design of everyday things and any future books that we go through. So hope to see you there.
Yeah.
All right. See you in a month from now for panel discussion number 2.
See you around. Bye.